Welcome everyone to the webinar. Before we get started, I want to just go over a few things and the main topics we'll cover on today's webinar. The first thing being the two main metrics that you should be focusing on when optimizing your site for the best performance. The next part will be the steps that you should take to effectively optimize your site for the best performance. And lastly, the tools and solutions to accomplish that. To start, before you start to optimize your site for the best performance, I generally recommend establishing a baseline for your site. That way you have results from before you optimize the site once you're done to see how effective and how much your site improved from a performance perspective once you are done. The two tools that I personally use the most for doing this are the Pingdom website speed test tool, as well as our own tool, the Sucuri global performance test tool. Pingdom's testing tool I prefer because it gives you a waterfall. If you're not familiar with what a waterfall is, it is basically a list of all of the requests for a site. So the CSS, JavaScript, HTML, images, external requests, any other type of request. And it gives a breakdown of how long that request takes to load. And it also includes additional metrics such as the page loads size and different breakdowns of that and various other metrics that are helpful. The second tool, the Sucuri Global Performance Testing tool, gives you three metrics from a lot of different locations around the world, which is helpful in establishing that initial baseline as well. I mentioned three other tools, GTmetrix, Web Page Test, and Google Page Speed Insights as well. I recommend trying all the tools and then picking the two or three that work best for you and what you're trying to accomplish. So when optimizing your site for the best performance, generally people focus on the letter grade that these tools provide. I don't recommend focusing on that as much. It's definitely a factor that you should look at, but it's not the main factor that I consider when optimizing a site for performance. One of the main reasons of that is it's generic recommendations for all websites out there. And what I mean by that is those are recommendations that aren't, they're tailored for your site in a way that it is tailored, but at the end, it's still generic recommendations applied across for all sites and not individually for your site. And it's an automated check. So having a good understanding of performance and understanding a waterfall and different things and the most important aspects of optimizing your performance are definitely a lot better than relying on that letter grade. The two main metrics that I focus on when optimizing sites for performance are the page load size. So that's the total kilo or megabytes that it takes for that site to load for a visitor, and then the number of requests. And that's all of the requests that are made up by the CSS, JavaScript, images, and other requests like that. Before you start optimizing your site for performance, I recommend going through and kind of doing a spring cleaning, similar to what you would kind of do in your house in the spring, kind of just go through and clean everything top to bottom. That's what I recommend doing with your site as well. First, before you get started, you'll want to make sure you take a full backup of your files and database. That way, if anything goes wrong while you're doing this, you have a backup to go to and you don't have to worry about losing any data or having any issues. Another thing I'll mention is ideally you're doing this on a staging or development environment and you're not doing this in a production environment. So if something does go wrong, it's not impacting your production site and it's only on a staging or a testing site. The next part is updating the content management system version you're using, whether that's WordPress, Drupal, Joomla, Magento, whatever it may be, and also the plugins and themes. Updating everything, often it contains security fixes and maintenance fixes along with new features. It also has the security benefit as that as well, because it often patches those security vulnerabilities, as I mentioned. The next part, going hand in hand, you just updated everything on your application. You'll also want to do that on the server. Now, depending on who your hosting provider is and how that is configured will depend on who's responsible for this. If you're on a managed server, managed plan, then you'll still want to reach out to your hosting provider and make sure that they are indeed keeping everything up to date, because some hosting providers do fall behind on this. If you are managing the server yourself or paying a developer or system administrator to do that for you, you'll definitely want to make sure that you're doing that yourself because that responsibility falls on you. The next part is removing any inactive plugins or themes. Generally, a habit that we see a lot is that if you aren't using a plugin or a theme, you may just deactivate it and leave it on your site. If you aren't using it, remove it, because that way can't be used as a possible attack vector when a potential attacker is trying to compromise your website, and it also can't impact the performance as well because it's totally removed. If you ever do need it later down the road, you can always reinstall it. Continuing on with spring cleaning, you don't want to have any backups on the server, anything that isn't needed for your production site to perform and function as it should. Often, for example, generally having backups and storing them on the same server as your production environment is never good practice anyway, because if something goes wrong on that production environment, well, your backups are on the same server, thus you can't rely on those normally because they will be impacted as well. The next part is having one purpose and one site per server. And what I mean by that is you don't want to have what's commonly referred to as a soup kitchen server of having all of your sites, email and every single possible function that you can think of on the server, because it not only hurts with performance, but it also generally introduces security risks in your environment as well. Ideally, you want to have one site per server. And if you have a lot of sites, that's generally not scalable or possible. And if that is the case, make sure you isolate them properly so that one can't impact the other. What we commonly see is sites continue to get reinfected through something that we refer to as cross-site contamination. And what that means is if one site is on the server and it's compromised and the other sites on the server aren't properly isolated from that site, it can cause that one site to impact all the other sites, and all the sites on the server get infected. The next part is removing old subdomains, domains, anything that isn't being used. So if you've had a server for a few years, you probably have had a few websites on it over time. If you aren't using one of those sites, remove it. If it's outdated and you still are using it, you should update it. And then the next thing is you don't want to use a production server as a development or staging server. As I mentioned, when ideally optimizing your site for performance, you don't want to do this on the production environment. The same thing goes with isolating the development and staging server from the production server, and that's just good development practice as well. The last part here kind of goes in hand with keeping backups of the site or server on the same server that your production environment is. You don't need to store personal files or any files that aren't needed for the production site to function. There's a lot better ways to store backups of personal files than a production server. The next part here is talking about hosting providers. So this kind of goes with like building a house. If you have a bad foundation to start, generally that house is going to run into problems right away, or if not right away, down the road. The same thing goes with hosting providers. If you have a good hosting provider, that goes a long way in ensuring that it's a reliable site that generally is more secure and performs and loads faster. There's different ways that you can go about approaching what hosting provider you go with. There's not one size fits all, and it's just something that you have to consider for your needs. The first, it's not as a common example is, but if you're a technical user and you have the skills, the time, and the availability to manage your server yourself, that's definitely something you can consider. Now, keep in mind of that availability part I mentioned. If your server goes down at 3 a.m. and you're sleeping, are you going to get up from that text or that phone call and fix the server? If it's a personal blog, maybe it can wait until the morning. But if it's an e-commerce site, then you most likely can't afford that downtime, and that's something that you have to consider if you're going to consider going that route. The next part is if you don't have the time or expertise to manage the server yourself, you can always pay a developer or system administrator to do that for you. The same thing goes in saying that that's the person you're going to be counting on if your site or server goes down. So make sure that they will be available and respond within the time limits that you need them to. And then lastly, the most common option is going with a managed hosting provider who will manage that server for you generally. And if there are issues, the responsibility falls on them from the server aspect of that. You also have to keep in mind with managed hosting providers of the support they offer. Do they offer the type of support you prefer in terms of chat, phone support, email support, ticket support, whatever it may be? Also, if you need a certain SLA or service level response time, are they offering that? And also you have to consider hours. So are they 24/7, 365, and is that what you need? Or can you manage to deal with a hosting provider that may only offer limited support on weekends, for example? For over 90% of people, managed hosting provider is the best fit, but you can consider those two other options as well. For themes, generally the best way to go about approaching a theme is going with a well-coded framework and then hiring a developer to customize that for your design needs. The reason that this is best is because you have a solid foundation. It's kind of the same thing with a hosting provider. And from there, you can pay a developer to customize the CSS, PHP, and any other programming language that you may need to fit it and make it unique for what you're trying to accomplish with your business. Some people with a theme try to go with a completely custom theme, but I generally don't recommend that, and it's generally not the best approach for the large majority of sites and businesses out there. The reason being for that is it generally increases the development time and cost. It will generally complicate updating it, as once that initial design is done, it'll make it more complex to keep that up to date. Say, for example, if that relationship ever ended with your developer or agency who did that theme originally, it can make it very difficult for a new developer agency to go in and keep that updated. It also generally, since you're not having a dedicated person or team like you might with a framework, keep that up to date, it is more likely to have performance issues or security vulnerabilities in it, as a general rule of thumb. If you have the time and you have the knowledge with CSS, PHP to customize the theme yourself, that's definitely something you can consider. Keep in mind, though, if you aren't very comfortable with PHP, you can very easily introduce vulnerabilities into your environment with insecure PHP code. So that's just something to keep in mind if you go that route. Lastly, a common question comes up of, well, how would I find a developer to help customize that framework that I decided on for my site? What I recommend first is reaching out to the people you know, your colleagues, your friends, and seeing who they have to recommend. If multiple people are recommending the same person, it's generally a good sign. But you can reach out to those people that they recommend and those developers and engage with them to see if they fit the needs of what you're trying to accomplish for your site and business. The next part is plugins. So going back to the spring cleaning part I referenced earlier, if you don't need a plugin, it's best to delete it, not just deactivate it. The next part is plugins don't come in one size. For example, with the WordPress repository, there are many WordPress plugins out there that can add social media buttons to your site. So Facebook, Twitter, the other major social networks. But they're all not created equally. Some plugin authors, if you check the WordPress forum for any users who have opened up support tickets, will reply very quickly. They'll follow through to the end. If it's a bug, they'll release a patch if it is a bug in the plugin. They'll keep it regularly up to date. They'll add new features. They'll patch any security vulnerabilities that are discovered and things like that. Also, code comes in a lot of different shapes and sizes. If you're not a developer, it's often hard to evaluate a plugin's code effectively. But if you are, I definitely recommend briefly taking a look at any plugins you're considering as code as well to get an idea of how secure or efficient it may be in those types of things. A lot of plugins have multiple features they offer. So, for example, a very popular WordPress plugin, Jetpack, has many different modules or features for it. it offers within its settings to go in and disable the modules that you aren't using. So if you're only using 5 of the modules that Jetpack offers, I recommend going and disabling all those other modules. You'll notice that it won't impact your performance and the load time of your site as much if you do that. The same goes for other plugins as well. And then the last part here being only use the necessary amount of plugins you do. One example is, say for example, you were trying to center the logo in the header of your site. Now, a lot of people would approach this of trying to add a plugin to accomplish this. While in almost all cases, this could be very easily done with a few lines of CSS that you would add to your theme's custom CSS file. And that's the route I would recommend going versus adding a plugin to accomplish something simple like that. The next part is optimizing images. So the first tool here is by TinyPNG. It gives a good idea of if you compressed all your images on a certain page, how much that would reduce the page load size of. And it's definitely something I recommend doing just to give you an idea of how much page load size you can save by optimizing your images. Now, I've tried a lot of the different image compression tools on the market, and there are definitely a lot. For when I've tested them, the 4 tools or solutions I recommend, depending on what CMS you're using or what way you're trying to compress the images, whether it's through a web interface, a plugin, API, things like that, are TinyPNG, Imagify, Kraken, and Optimus. I recommend you check out each one and pick the one that works best for you. Continuing on with optimizing images, so resizing images to scale. And to give you an example of what I mean by that, say for example, you have an image on your site that is 1,000 by 1,000 pixels. But when a visitor goes to it, the actual image size that's displayed on your site is 500 by 500 pixels. So in reality, that full image size of 1,000 by 1,000 pixels is still loading in the background, adding unnecessary page load size to the total page load size for your site and generally being resized using HTML. The best way to go about this is resizing that image to scale and then re-uploading it to be 500 by 500 pixels to save on that total page load size for your site. GTmetrix has a great section on this where it will provide any image that you can resize and the exact dimensions you should resize them to. The next part here being using the correct image format. And what I mean by that is there's several different image formats out there, JPEG, PNGs, and just making sure if you're designing an image, for example, in Photoshop, that you're using not only the best image type from a visual standpoint, but also from a standpoint of performance, and that it's the smallest and most efficient image type possible for the image that you are designing. The next part is a newer web or image format that was actually just kind of invented by Google is WebP. It's not supported by all major browsers yet. Safari and Internet Explorer should add support for it, I imagine, pretty shortly. But you can still convert your PNG and JPEG images to WebP image format to save on that total page load size. Optimus, which is a tool that I recommended to compress images on the previous slide, offers an option to convert your images to the WebP image format. So it's definitely something I recommend doing, especially if you have a lot of images on your site. The last part here of compressing images is using CSS sprites. An example of this would be, say, for example, you have 5 social media buttons in the top right-hand header of your site. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and things like that. Instead of those 5 images loading, you can use what's called a CSS sprite with a few lines of CSS so that instead of having 5 images, you would have 1 image, and the CSS would basically clarify the dimensions within that 1 image of the image that you need for what that social media button is. So you would save 4 requests and just add a few lines of CSS to accomplish that. And that's definitely something that you can consider doing. Some other areas to focus on when optimizing your site for performance, the first one being external requests. An external request is any request that doesn't load directly from your site or server. To clarify in a little bit more detail here, a common example of this is ads. Another example is analytics, so Google Analytics and the other analytics solutions out there. With external requests, it is a little bit generally more difficult to optimize these requests as you don't have total control over these. One thing you can do is if the request isn't absolutely necessary, you can remove it. Another option is, for example, say if it's JavaScript, you can load it asynchronously. That way, when it's loading in the background, it's not blocking other requests from loading. And then if those two aren't options and you need that request to load and it is causing a significant impact on your page load time, it's generally best to reach out to your developer to see if there are any ways to optimize that external request to make it as efficient as possible. The next part here is compression. So gzip compression has been around for a long time, and I recommend enabling it on your site if you aren't using gzip compression. It's a great way to reduce the page load size, and it's something that's generally very easily to implement. There's a newer type of compression called Brotli compression, which was also created by Google. It's not supported by all major browsers, and in my testing, it's definitely better than gzip compression. But since it isn't supported by all the major browsers yet, if you don't implement it exactly right, it can cause some conflicts. So be aware of that if you are going to consider using it before all the major browsers add support for it. The next part here is HTTP 2. This is a newer protocol that was supposed to help with basically from HTTP 1.1, and it will impact any requests loading over HTTPS. If you aren't sure if you're using HTTP 2, I recommend reaching out to your hosting provider, and if they do offer it, make sure you have it enabled, and if they don't, encourage them to add it as a feature because it does have many performance benefits for HTTPS. The next part here being minification. If you aren't familiar with what minification is, it simply removes the white spaces and unnecessary characters and other things from typically your CSS and JavaScript. If you're using gzip compression already, the amount of benefit that minification will have is generally smaller, but if you have the opportunity to implement it, it's definitely something you can do, but I wouldn't go out of your way to implement it if you're already using gzip compression. But it can have a little bit more of a benefit with decreasing that page load size. The next part here is concatenating static files. What that means is typically you take all of your CSS and say, for example, you have 10 CSS files to load for all one URL on your site or one page. What concatenation would do is it would combine those 10 CSS files into one or two CSS files. And the same thing applies with JavaScript. So it would reduce the amount of total requests for your site. This can have a positive performance impact, but if you are using HTTPS and HTTP2, it can make the benefits that the HTTP2 protocol that it's set out for kind of negligible. So it was kind of concatenation as a workaround to some of the performance, basically lack of performance, how the HTTP 1.1 protocol was designed. So keep that in mind. If you're using HTTPS and HTTP2, you most likely shouldn't implement it. I always recommend with performance, though, testing it for your site and seeing what performs best because it does vary per site and per configuration, as every site is very different. The next part here is domain sharding. What that means is if you're using what's called a content delivery network, which we'll talk a little bit more in detail in a few slides here, you will typically load your CSS, JavaScript, and your static files through a subdomain such as cdn.example.com. What domain sharding would do is it would add additional subdomains for those static files such as cdn1.example.com, etc. This was a more popular performance tactic and benefit a few years ago. It's become less popular generally within the past few years. it's something you can implement, but for typically it's not necessary for the little benefit it provides. But it's definitely something, if you are using a content delivery network, you should check in and consider doing, because it could have a performance benefit depending on your configuration. The next part here is generally when website owners are experiencing performance issues, their first kind of inclination or approach is to upgrade their hosting plan or add more resources, being CPU and RAM, to their server. Generally, that's not the approach that I recommend starting with. Generally, what I recommend doing is optimizing your application and server as much as possible. And if you're still having hosting issues and performance issues at that point, then you might consider looking at upgrading your plan or adding more resources to your server. But that's generally not the best approach starting out with. The next part here is upgrading PHP. So if you're using an older version of PHP, such as PHP 5.3 or 5.4, you should reach out to your hosting provider and see if they offer a more recent version of PHP, such as 5.6 or PHP 7. They have many performance benefits that the older versions of PHP didn't provide, and they also have other benefits as well. And if your hosting provider supports those, then as long as your application and any plugins, extensions, themes like that support that newer version of PHP as well, you should definitely look into upgrading that. The next thing is enabling Keep Alive. What Keep Alive does is that anytime a request is loaded through your site, there's what's called a handshake that is necessary on the networking end for that request to basically go through. And what Keep Alive does is, instead of having that handshake for every single request, it will use this first handshake for all the subsequent requests, saving on the amount of handshakes for your site. And it kind of goes back to the principle of doing the same amount of things with basically less time. So it's definitely something you should implement, and it's generally something that's very easily can be done in most configurations. The next thing is fixing or removing 404 not found errors. If you're not familiar with what a 404 response code is, it simply means that that request or file was not able to be found, or it's not a valid path for that file. So if that file is just, that file path is referencing the wrong file path and you just need to update that, then you should update that in your code if need be. But if that file is no longer needed for your site, you should remove that reference in the code, because it'll save your page load time will basically decrease as a result of doing that. The next part here is fixing multiple redirects. As an example for this, say you have a CSS file and it's loading over www and you're forcing HTTPS on the site. But in the code, you're referencing the naked or root domain and HTTP instead of HTTPS. The browser, when that visitor goes to the site, is going to have to follow that redirect twice before it gets to that end result of HTTPS and www. You should always put the URL in the code that it ends up being. That way the browser doesn't have to follow multiple redirects, just increasing that page load time for an unnecessary reason. The last parts here of some other areas to focus on are a general good rule of thumb is putting the CSS in the header of the site and the JavaScript in the footer of the site. Now, for some features on your site, you may have to put some JavaScript in the header of your site. If that is the case, you'll want to make sure you load that JavaScript asynchronously. That way it's not blocking other requests as it's loading. The next part here being lazy loading images. What that means is that, say for example, you have 100 images on your site, but when a visitor goes and loads your site, only 10 images are within the screen or visual view of that screen for that visitor. What lazy loading images would do is it would only load those 10 images initially, and then as that user scrolls down and more images come within view visually for that visitor, it would load those images, but not until then. If you have a lot of images on your site, it can be beneficial for your performance, but if you just have an average amount of images, it's generally not something that would be necessary to implement. The last part being here is a WordPress plugin called Query Monitor. It's generally geared more towards technical users or developers, but it has various statistics and things such as it will give you the time to execute different database queries, and will point out the database queries that are taking longer. That way you can look into optimizing those. So if you do use WordPress and you are more of a technical user, it's definitely a plugin that you can at least check out when you're optimizing your site for performance. Now, when talking about performance as a whole, I focused on those other areas at first because those areas aren't often as talked about, while they are still very beneficial and key parts when optimizing your site for performance. Now, the two, I would say, most talked about ways to optimize your site for performance are caching and content delivery networks. They're often referred to as CDNs. So basically, what caching and content delivery networks accomplish is they generally reduce the page or overall load on the host server, and they also make the page load faster for the visitor. There are several different types of caching. The first one is a content delivery network. To give you an example of what a content delivery network is, say, for example, your site is hosted on one server in Arizona, but you have a majority of your visitors in Europe. Well, regardless where the visitor comes in the world, they're still going to be routed to that one server in Arizona, since that's the only server where your site's hosted. With a content delivery network, it will generally have what's called multiple points of presence, or servers located around the world in a lot of different continents and areas. That way, a visitor in Europe would hit one of the points of presence or servers in Europe instead of the server in Arizona where your site's hosted, thus reducing the page load time for that visitor. The second type of caching is what I would call server caching. An example of this is something called varnish. Another common setup is, for example, you have Apache, but you're running Nginx in front of Apache as a reverse proxy and using that for caching. There's a lot of different server configurations and caching options out there. That's just two examples. The last part here is, instead of caching it on the server itself, you're caching it on the application, so more at like the content management system. There's a lot of plugins out there for the variety of content management systems with application caching, and that's kind of the third type of caching. Now, when considering your different options out there for caching and content delivery networks, keep in mind that it's generally always a good idea to use caching and a CDN. But there is a point in time that comes where it's just redundant, meaning that if you have too many layers of caching, or if you have several content delivery networks, the benefit is really marginal at that point versus just using one caching method or two caching methods in one CDN versus using, say, all three caching methods in all like two content delivery networks. It also generally complicates troubleshooting, makes the process of updating your site more difficult, and things like that. Now, the question is, how does the Sucuri Firewall integrate and help with the performance of your site? The first thing is we have what's called a global Anycast network. Right now, we have 6 points of presence, 3 in the United States, 2 in Europe, and 1 in Japan, and that operates as a content delivery network. That way, the visitor's request is routed to the closest server to them, helping reduce the latency and help with the performance of your site. The next part is caching. So we have caching in place also with those different points of presence on our global Anycast network. And if we have that request cached already, we can return that request directly to the visitor from our cache. That way we don't even have to send a request to your host server, thus reducing the your load on your host server, as well as speeding up that page load time for your visitor. The next two options here are compression and HTTP2. These are both options within our interface that you can enable with just a simple click, and it's gzip compression, HTTP2. We talked about those earlier in the other areas of that you should focus on when optimizing your site for the best performance. And if you use our firewall, I definitely recommend you enable those features if you haven't already. Here's just a list of resources that I referenced in the webinar that you can refer back to. And again, as Val mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you will get a copy of these slides a few days down the road here. That's it for on my side of what I wanted to cover for optimizing your site for the best performance. Thanks for taking the time to listen, and I will pass it now back over to Val so we can answer some of the questions you guys had.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Caleb, for the awesome presentation. A lot of questions, a lot of questions came in. Most likely we will not be able to get to all of them now, but as I said, we will be answering all of them, and Caleb will personally go through them and send all the questions and the answers to you via email. The first one that stuck out here was Stacy Clemens was asking, when you were saying about having one website per server if possible, she's wondering actually, do you recommend against having a VPS, for example, because having a dedicated server for every website would be sort of cost prohibitive for some of the people out there?
Right. So with a VPS, you are able to isolate the sites within the separate environments so that one can't impact the other in terms of the issue that I was referring to earlier with cross-site contamination. And it's best to engage your hosting provider with that because depending on the configuration of the server, it can vary on if your sites are properly isolated on that VPS. And if they aren't properly isolated, you find out from your hosting provider or your developer, definitely engage with them and figure out the way that with their configuration on how to accomplish that so the sites are properly isolated on that virtual private server if you have more than one site on it.
Great. Jeff Dorman is asking if people should have their DB, their databases on the same server as the Apache or the web server, or what do you recommend there?
Again, this is a question that will come back to your configuration on how it's configured. It just depends on basically how that server is laid out, configured, structured with your hosting provider. And again, it depends on your needs as well. With a smaller site, they may be able to function fine on the same server but if it's a bigger site, you may need to isolate your application and have a separate server for the database. That's something that, as you get a bigger site, it can become a lot more complicated with your environment as you add more servers for, your database, your application. Then you have email as well if you don't have a third-party provider for that and, integrating load balancers and things. So that's really best to engage your developer, system admin, and hosting provider about to see what would work best for your needs.
Perfect. Kostas is asking, is there a metric you prefer to use when calculating page speed? And he's giving some examples like asynchronous loading, or doesn't this make total page load time go up and such? So what what metrics should people use to calculate page speed?
Yeah, I talked a little bit about this earlier in the webinar. So what I generally recommend doing is establishing a baseline like I talked about I referenced 5 tools there, and you'll get a copy of the slides to get the links to those. But Pingdom and then our tool we have as well that we offer publicly, we have a Sucuri performance testing tool. Those are the 2 tools I recommend and generally use myself. But I recommend trying out the other solutions that I referenced as well and seeing what works best for you. But yeah, you definitely, when you're optimizing the site for the best performance, you want to focus on reducing that page load time. And the 2 metrics that I generally focus on to accomplish reducing that page load time are the total page load size and then the number of requests.
Mm-hmm. Good. How would we know if our host supports Keep Alive that you mentioned? What should people ask their hosts to make sure this is something they have?
Generally, if you open a support ticket or however way you typically contact your hosting provider, if you engage with them directly and ask them if they support Keep Alive and if it's already enabled on your server, they will be quite familiar with what Keep Alive is and be able to answer that for you. If they aren't familiar with what it is, possibly, we have a blog post actually in the resources where we mention Keep Alive and the necessary changes you would need to make on your end to enable that. And like I mentioned before several times, you'll get a copy of these slides. The second to last slide in the resources section and the first link, you'll find more details about how to implement Keep Alive if it's not already implemented.
Great. Yeah, and for those of you who came on late, I see a lot of questions about the recording. Yes, we did mention we will have a video recording of the entire webinar, so don't worry, you didn't miss anything. And we have another question, Caleb. Actually, I think 3 or 4 persons asked the same thing when you mentioned about multiple redirects. And the question is, for fixing that, is your recommendation to change relative paths to absolute?
That will depend on, again, your configurations. So if your site supports HTTP and HTTPS, then that is definitely an option and something that you should consider doing. But if you're forcing, for example, HTTPS on the site, then absolute paths necessarily wouldn't be necessary in that path, or necessarily the best solution in that circumstance. So you kind of just have to consider those scenarios of, are you forcing HTTPS? Are you allowing both? And then go with the best option you see, whether it's absolute paths or having just HTTP or HTTPS. Along with, you have to consider the naked domain or the root domain, and then you also have to consider if you're forcing redirects to www or not on how you would configure that as well.
Yeah. The last question I'm going to pick today, sorry guys, there's a lot of questions, but time is kind of limited. Do you have, Caleb, any tips for mobile speed optimization for the websites?
Okay, for mobile website performance and speed, there is something that I didn't cover in the webinar, but is something I was recently added, which is called AMP. It was created by Google as a way to help with mobile site, or just any site that's loading over a mobile device, load quicker. So I will mention this in more detail in the question and answers and provide a more detailed answer as to how to implement AMP on your site and generally more things to look for in that. But in the meantime, that's generally a good idea and something you should check out if you haven't already. Another thing as well as, a few years ago, it was very common to have a separate mobile site and a desktop site. But within the past few years, it's become more common just to have a responsive site. That way, regardless of the device that your visitor is coming to the site from, it will resize your site to fit that screen, basically. So if you don't have a responsive site already, that's definitely something you can consider as well for cross-device compatibility.
Great. Thanks, Caleb, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for participating today. All of the questions, as we mentioned before, will be answered by Caleb. We'll be sending them to all the registrants. We'll make sure that you have the video recording as well, and also the slides will be provided. And please take a few moments when this webinar will end to reply to our survey, just to make sure how you got the information, and we want to know more about you. Thank you very much, and we'll be happy to have you next time here.
Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.